Great. So good evening, everybody. It's 6 o'clock. Time to start as promised. My name is Olakunle Kasumo. I'm the moderator for today. I'm with the Nigeria History Group. Nigeria History Group, just a brief introduction. We are a group of people with common interests in studying history, particularly Nigerian history. And that brought us together on a platform where we share findings, research findings, ideas, throughout questions, pictures, videos, etc., etc. And it has just kept on growing. Our passion for history is one that we all share, and a common belief that to be able to go forward, there has to be adequate understanding of what happened in the past. In other words, if you're going to build Nigeria, we Nigerians have to understand, we need to understand Nigerian history as much as possible. Let's dive into what we have for today. It's a debate. What we have today is a debate, and it's a very important one, very crucial one, very critical one. So I will introduce the debaters. There are two primary debaters and then two support debaters. So let me introduce the two debaters to us, starting with many more. Where do I start? Okay, anyway, let me start with Dele Ogun. Dele Ogun is a talented Londoner, a Nigerian-born intellectual, a lawyer, presenter, international speaker, and commentator on current affairs. He is a polymath, certainly, and author with strong connections to Nigeria. He is the author of the very popular A Fatherless People. I'm sure you must have bumped into that book at one time or another. If you have not, then you want to bump into that book very quickly. So A Fatherless People, this is the author of A Fatherless People, and of course, the convener of Fatherland. So it's a pleasure to have this very distinguished gentleman, lawyer, in our midst, and historian, I have to say, in our midst. Welcome.
Thank you, Kunle. Thank you.
All right. Then supporting Dele Ogun is Dr. Gabriel Eke. So Dr. Eke is supporting Dele Ogun. I will share the subject very soon. But Dr. Eke is a surgeon, scientist, strategist, and poet. He's an African of mixed heritage from the Igbo and Kalabari nations. He's a gifted multilingualist and a staunch promoter of the Orange Union geopolitical principle, especially Africanism. So you're welcome, Dr. Eke. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Next, I would like us to meet our second main debater, which is Tunde Leye. Tunde, please, would like you to share your screen, your camera. Tunde, my good old friend. Tunde Leye is an author, filmmaker, storyteller, and a history buff. He likes to be called a storyteller more than any other thing, and he is a great storyteller. He has told stories in books, films, and on stage in Nigeria, the United Kingdom, and the United Arab Emirates. He's also I've described him as a history buff, so you know for sure that he's a lover of history. Tunde is the author of one of my favorite books titled Afonja. It's a series of books, actually. Afonja, he's written two in that particular series, and it introduces you, if you get to read it, it will introduce you to the history of the Oyo Empire like no other book I have read. So it's a pleasure to have Tunde Leye with us here. And then supporting Tunde Leye is Cheta Nwanze. Cheta, please, can you unmute and then let's see your video? There we go. Cheta, nice to have you. Nice to have you here. Nice to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Cheta, you probably would have heard of this gentleman. If you've not, well, consider it's a great thing to hear about him. What a great guy. Cheta is a strategist, researcher, international security scholar, editor, and historian. He's a professional researcher, actually, policy analyst, and risk advisor with experience working on products, government, public interest sectors, academia, non-profits, and the private sector. Cheta has done a lot helping Nigerians to understand Nigerian history via the social media, particularly over many, many years. So it's great to have Cheta here, who will be supporting Tunde Leye. Welcome.
Thank you once again.
Okay, great. So let me quickly just spell out the topic. Transatlantic slave trade. Who were the primary agents? Africans or Europeans? Who were the primary agents? The Europeans came to Africa and took people away across the oceans to the Americas as slaves. But were they the primary agents, or should we be beaming our light on the Africans who were their partners, their local partners, the local agents here, who some will say took their own brothers, sold their own brothers to the white man for alcohol and arms and so on and so forth. So who should we beam the light on? The Africans who sold their own brothers, or the Europeans who came here and took away our people across the oceans to the Americas? So basically, this debate is about this very, very important subject. And I say important, I emphasize important because it is at the heart of this subject, even within certain aspects of the academia globally. So I will open the floor to the debaters. Tunde Leye and Cheta are going to be arguing, Dele Ogun and Gabriel Eke are going to be arguing that the primary agents were the Europeans. Tunde Leye and Cheta will be countering that. That's the way this debate is going to go. So I will start by opening the floor to the main debaters. So we yield the floor to Dele Ogun.
Thank you very much. Let me proceed without delay. Let's be clear as to what we're discussing. The trans-Africans or the Europeans. I'm restating the issue so that there's no confusion as regards what we are discussing. The transatlantic slave trade. Who started it is a relevant question. The answer is simple. It was started by the Portuguese before later being escalated by the British. Point number one. Second point, how did it start? Because these issues are relevant to the consideration of the answer to who were the primary agents. So how did it start? It started when they came to us. Note, we did not go to them. We did not have a trade in our people that we took to them. They came to us. This was in the wake of the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans, the Caliphate, on 29th of May, 1453, to be exact. Prior to that point, there was no transatlantic slave trade. Let's be clear on that. There was no transatlantic slave trade prior to that point. Yes, Europeans had been buying Africans, but they'd been buying them from the Arabs through the trans-Saharan slave trade. The way to understand this is that where we were, it was like a cookie jar that their hand could not reach where we were from the north. It was the Arabs who, in the northern parts of Africa, were selling Africans to the Europeans. What then happened following the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans is that the trade routes that the Europeans were using to get to Asia became blocked. That now forced the Portuguese to start coming down the coast of Africa, coming south. That is what brought them round the curve to West Africa. That is when they had found a back door into our people. Now, when I say our people, is now the people of the west coast of Africa. They didn't have access to previously. They found the back door. They now didn't need to buy from the Arabs. They now could access our people through the back door, which is our coastline. Now, in anticipation of the fall of Constantinople, just before, in 1452, remember I said Constantinople fell 1453, 29th of May. In 1452, anticipating the fall of Constantinople, Pope Nicholas V issued
Recording in progress.
the papal bull Dom Diversus to King Alfonso V of Portugal, authorizing him to, and I quote, invade, search out and capture, vanquish and subdue all Saracens and pagans. We came under the definition of pagans whatsoever and other enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Now, let us understand the market for our people, because again, that is a relevant consideration. 1493, we now move forward about 50 years to 1493, was when the papal bull Inter Cetera authorized Spain to, again I quote, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, wherever they may be. In this way, this was the papal bull, or if you like, it's when I say papal bull, it means a decree, like a military decree. But this one issued by the Pope. The Pope divided the world into two, with west of the Azores being marked as Spain's exclusive sphere, and east of the line being Portugal's. This bull, papal bull, in summary, gave Africa to Spain. That's very important context for what we're discussing. We then move forward to 1518. What I'm giving you is a brief chronology of the European slave trade. 1518 was when the Spanish introduced the asiento. What was the asiento? It was a license issued by the King of Spain, authorizing, it was a licensing traders to supply Spain and Spanish America with the slaves that they needed. The Spanish were not going in themselves. They gave license and the contract for the supply of all the slaves that they needed. In August 1518, the Spanish king authorized the shipment of enslaved Africans direct from Africa to the Americas. Let's look briefly at the history of this very important contract for the supply of slaves. The French held the asiento up until the Spanish War of Succession, which was 1701 to 1714. The treaty, this was a European war where they were taking positions on the possibility of France and Spain merging to become one country. And so all the European powers got involved. The peace treaty that ended that war in 1714 was the Treaty of Utrecht. What did that treaty do in relation to what we're discussing? It transferred the Asiento from France to Great Britain. That's when Britain escalated a trade that the Portuguese had started. We then move forward quickly to our next date in the chronology, 1749. What happened then? King George II of Britain, the then head of the Church of England, so this is the counterpart of the Pope that had licensed the trade in the first instance. King George II of Britain, the head of the Church of England, passed the Act, the Trade to Africa Act, 1749. What did that act say that is relevant to our discussion? It said this, listen carefully. Whereas the trade to and from Africa is very advantageous to Great Britain and necessary for supplying the plantations and colonies thereunto belonging with a sufficient number of Negroes at reasonable rates, and therefore for this purpose, the trade ought to be free and open to all his subjects. You see, at that point, Britain did not need the Asiento any longer. It was now the superpower, the king of the oceans, and it was throwing the trade open and declaring it's beneficial to us. We need these people. We then move to my next date in the chronology, indeed the final date, because this final date was relevant. It was the immediate background to the stop that was then put on the trade in 1807. When the trade was abolished in 1807, this was the background. This was the American Declaration of Independence of 1776. The War of Independence ended in 1783. That led to a constitutional convention in America, 1787. Now, what is the relevance of that 1787 date? It is this, that the Americans trying to agree a new constitution between themselves, they met an obstacle in the resistance of the slave-dependent states, Georgia and Carolina, who were refusing to sign up to the new constitution. The only way they were persuaded to sign up and join the union was a concession made by the rest of them, that for 20 years, the slave trade will be allowed to continue. So there was a 20-year moratorium. When you add the 20 to 1787, that takes the trade, both America and Britain passed a law stopping the trade. That is the brief historical chronology. Let me move swiftly to the tools of the trade, because trades are conducted with tools, and that's an indicator of whose trade it was, who were the primary actors. The trade, I want to emphasize this point, very important point. Our people, when they were taken and shipped away, were not slaves. They were captives. They were prisoners of war. They were not in a state of slavery. They became enslaved by the Europeans when they shipped them away on those ships. Let's look at the tools. The essential tools of the trade were guns.
So you have a minute more.
My time has flown. Guns, gunpowder, rum, slave ships, chains and shackles, slave forts, all produced by the Europeans. Let me move forward if I've only got a minute, because how they conducted the trade was by proxy wars. That is that they supplied the arms, the weapons to our people on the ground, and rum as well, in order to generate the supplies. But here's the most important point. Who had the experience and the know-how? The answer was the Europeans. Why do I say so? The crucial evidence is to be found in a book titled The Norman Conquest by Mark Morris. This is what it reveals. Although many books on the Anglo-Saxons do not say much about it, more than 10% of England's populations were slaves in the 11th century. Slavery was a widespread institution in early medieval Europe, and the sale and export of slaves was one of the main motors of the economy. Since the 9th century, the trade's most outstanding exponents have been the Vikings, whose warfare was predicated, for the most part, on seizing young men, women as merchandise to be sold either at home or in Scandinavia, or very commonly to Arab merchants. England was one of their principal hunting grounds. Conclusion. From the start to the finish, it was a European enterprise that came with the blessing of their spiritual leaders, the tools of the trade, and the experience of them selling each other. The claim that we were selling our own people is the mother of all lies, which has now been thoroughly exposed. I thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Just for the sake of audience, the main debaters have 12 minutes each, and he was absolutely on point. This is exactly 12 minutes since he started speaking. And the debaters already know how many minutes they'll be speaking, how many minutes each person will be speaking. But I will let us know for the COVID debaters when it is their turn. So thank you very much, Mr. Dile Ogun. Thank you for that opening. You will be back very soon. Let me open the floor to on this debate. Tunde, you have the floor. 12 minutes.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone for joining this debate. It's indeed a pleasure, and this is something that gives me great joy to do. And thanks to Mr. Dile Ogun for marshalling his points in the way that he has. I'll start by doing this. First is this, that in the same way that context has been created, around the transatlantic slave trade from the European side, it's important to create the context of what was happening before the trade commenced from the African side. And the reason I say this is because my position is that agency was present on both sides, and that the agency, there was no side that was unaware of what the slave trade was about, and participation was with full agency from both sides. Now, prior to the transatlantic slave trade commencing, there were two other slave trades that had been present on the African continent. The Saharan slave trade that Mr. Ogun alluded to, and the second was the Indian Ocean slave trade that went from the Swahili coast to India. Now, those two slave trades, the one that is relevant to this conversation is the Trans-Saharan slave trade. There were significant empires in the Sahel that supplied the Mediterranean world, and from there into Europe, African slaves prior to the transatlantic slave trade. Now, the most important of these was one that, interestingly, is part of present-day Nigeria, the Kanem Bornu Empire. In fact, it extended all the way into parts of Libya, into the Fez and Fezan and all of those parts of the North African, what is presently North Africa, in order to control the full corridor of getting slaves to the Maghreb, into North Africa, and then towards Egypt, into Europe. And when the Ottomans came, this was the primary thing that the people on that side tried to secure. The fall of a lot of the empires, especially the penultimate one on the Sahel, on the other side, on the western side of the Sahel, the Songhai, was also powerfully linked to this. Now, why do I say this? There was a culture of supplying of slaves actively into a trade that went into other parts of the world. Now, most of the other people on the other side did not have to come into the heart of Africa to fetch and get the slaves. There was full organization. States were fully organized. If you read the Kano Chronicles that start from the 900s all the way to the early 1900s, late 1800s, it documents very extensively Kano's participation in the slave trade from the 1400s when it really came into its own. It documents the participation of other Hausa states when they participated in slave trade as well, because of their proximity to the Sahel. The conquest of the Constantinople by the Ottoman Empire that then forced the Europeans to look for a new way. What we know and what was documented, the primary driver of that search for a new way was to get to India, not to go and fetch slaves from Africa. That was the primary driver. It was to round the Cape of Good Hope to get to India and get spices. But along the way, they began to trade, first for gold. In fact, the first castle that was built was Elmina. So the primary driver, even of the Europeans at the time, was trade. It so happened that at the same time, plantation economies began to open up. First on coasts, on islands off the African coast, and then in the Americas and the present-day Caribbean. And in the search for labor for those places, they first enslaved the natives of those places by force, and then when they couldn't, the natives of those places died off because of disease. They then fetched indentured whites from Europe to work those plantations. Ultimately, they began to trade in slaves. And what happened was that a lot of the trade that went into the Indian Ocean and went into the trans-Saharan slave trade was diverted towards the Atlantic. And new networks, new city-states, new empires formed due to the emergence of this slave trade. Some of them include, for example, the Oyo Empire, which emerged in the 1600s, the Dahomey, which emerged in the 1700s, all of the empires that emerged around the Pra-Offin Basin, the Denchiria, and then the Akan, the Ashanti, the Fanti, all of those peoples emerged to take advantage of the slave trade. If you move to the Niger Delta coast as well, all of the Ijaw, Ishekiri city-states, and even some of the Igbo ones like the Andoni and Co. of Abo, emerged to take advantage of the reflow of trade towards the coast. Now, all of these people participated in this trade with agency. So agency was coming from Europe, and they had, of course, all of the technological advantage and co. But until the 1800s, Europeans did not penetrate into the heart of Africa to fetch slaves. Until the invention of quinine, all of the slaves that were fetched from Africa and sold were fetched by other Africans who picked up Africans either in the course of war. A full 35% were kidnapped by people that they knew, their neighbors, people that were well. So when you take all of this together, full credit systems, full states, people, elites participating with full knowledge. I'll give two examples. There is a gentleman from Calabar, Duketown in Calabar, called Antara Duke in the late 1700s, who had visited Liverpool, who had visited all the places in Europe and documented his participation in the slave trade with full agency in his own words. So not the words of the European writing, but his own words. You can look at the participation of people like Efunre Tinubu, who were unabashed about their slave trading. You can look at the participation of even returnee slaves who came back after having experienced slave trade to come and be slave traders themselves. What I say is this, that there were agents on the European side, and they were very, very aggressive about coming to Africa to trade. But when they got to Africa, they dealt with principal primary African slave traders who had full agency and full knowledge of what they were doing, what they were participating in, and in fact had built cultures and identities around being slave traders. And we can find this all along the slave coast. So there is none of the peoples along the slave coast that is exempt from this. Now, does this absolve the Europeans of their actions and the things that they did during the slave trade? Absolutely not. But we should not discount and discard the role that Africans played in the trade. In the argument that Mr. Ogun made, he talked about that people were not slaves before they came to the coast. They were just captives. Samuel Ajayi Crowther documented how he arrived at the coast in his biography. And he was very clear about the sale and the resale of his person until he got to the coast and was sold. I don't know what else you call people that are sold if they are not slaves. Olaudah Equiano, many years before him, documented the same thing. What's the name of the Canary one that ended up in Sierra Leone? Ali documented exactly the same thing. Sarah Forbes Bonetta documented exactly the same thing, and many, many others. So we cannot play semantics with were people slaves before they left Africa. They were fully slaves, and they knew that they were slaves, and their sellers knew that they were slaves. And if they tried to escape, they would have been treated as slaves before they boarded any European ship. They were sold, and they were sold by Africans, taken to Europe on European ships, but sold by Africans to those Europeans. Thank you very much.
Dr. Eke, are you there?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah. All right. So you've got 8 minutes maximum. You may or may not use up the 8 minutes, but you have the floor to support Mr. Ogun's argument and offer some counters to the arguments just made now by Mr. Tunde.
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, I'll just make a summary equation of the transatlantic slave trade. That the transatlantic slave trade did not exist until the Europeans arrived. That's the first thing. And essentially, in that equation, if you exclude the Western Europeans, there will never be any transatlantic slave trade. It's that simple. I think that sums the whole debate today. But let's go into further details. So the first aspect is the cultural aspect. The Africans, by their culture at the time, across the Atlantic belt, basically did not indulge in that sort of. And in fact, across most of their nations, it was an abomination. Now, because these were mostly settled civilizations along that Atlantic belt, with high respect for human life. Now, their cultures were more of jubilation, celebration throughout. And that they've been like that for a very long time. Now, if you contrast that to the European culture at the time, theirs was a constant medieval, the so-called Dark Ages, a time of misery, exploitation, and a long-standing medieval history of slavery, starting from the Scandinavian aspects all the way down to the Balkans and the Mediterranean. In fact, at the time, the Greeks and the Bulgarians were still under the Ottoman Turkish slavery. So specifically, the Western Europeans also were the primary agents, obviously, as we know. The second point is the control. Who was in control of all of this? Now, the weapons and the geopolitical means of power was in the hands of the Western Europeans to authorize and abolish the slave trade. The Atlantic belt of Africa, from Guinea all the way down to Angola, was attacked, invaded, and many kingdoms were destroyed and defeated by the slave invasion from Western European governments and their monarchs. And you need to bear in mind that their navy, the European navy and military might, was behind the slave trade. If you take the notes in their libraries about Henry Dundas, who was the Secretary of State for War, he was in Britain at the time. The historical documents obviously make it very clear that the Dundas was actually one of the proponents of the slave trades, and involved even in the attempt for British invasion of Haiti when the enslaved people tried to revolt against the slave trade. And so at the end of the day, in terms of control of the trade, these coastal communities were victims that were attacked, destroyed, and forced into a situation of perpetrated exploitation. Now let's come into the third aspect, which is the commercial profit perspective. I mean, I don't see where the evidence of the Africans having been involved and made any profit out of that trade. There's hardly any evidence if you go across the entire breadth of the Atlantic belt from Guinea to Angola. You'd hardly see any evidence of profit made from that trade. Hardly any. Practically almost none, virtually. But if you look at the European side, you've got over 40,000 slave ships involved, deployed by the Western European hegemony into the transatlantic slave trade. Now, about 35,000 of these slave ships were officially insured with business insurance for slave trade. And the number of pirate slave trades, we're not talking about those at all. So the total investment from slave ships, warships, weapons, trading posts, coastal forts, shackles, chains, fees, itinerary logistics involved was entirely Western European sponsored. The Africans were entirely victims, complete losers with regards to the transatlantic slave trade. So there's nothing in Africa to show for that profit. Now, if you go down, the compensation for abolition of the transatlantic slave trade paid to the Western European slave traders was only finally paid off in May 2016. And take note of what the British Lord Clarendon said in 1846. For our necessaries and our luxuries of life, for the employment of our people, our revenues, and our very position in the world as a nation, we are indebted to the production of slave labor. If you come to, let's say, what is Nigeria now, at the time, there were only 4 points on the eastern flanks where you have the slave ports, and that's the Boni, Abonima, the Oguta, and Onitsha. That's the only points you can have the slave smuggling going through. And that was coordinated through the Arochukwu central area. Not all the people were involved, but there were some people involved. Now, bear in mind that these were actually illegal things, secret things. These were not official positions across those places. The only place that was actually defeated, subjugated, was the Boni side that had to compromise. And even within themselves, there was war and fighting because most of those coastal areas fought to fight and defend themselves against this slave thing. But obviously, they were mostly damaged, destroyed, and subjugated. So if you come to the western flank, you probably have Kosoko and Madam Tinubu, if anything. And I mean, I hardly know of any specific other people you can mention. Okay, so I think the bottom line is all evidence of historical common sense and facts confirm once and for all that the Western European hegemony is entirely and solely the primary agency of this transatlantic slave trade. As you can see, if you look at what they profited from it and what they invested into it, it's enormous. And let's not forget, we always say, you hear people saying they never got into the coastal lands or the hinterlands. Actually, the factual thing is they were present physically there in numbers, huge numbers of warships from the 1700s were present across the whole coastal area. That presence of warships doubled in the 19th century. Now, so they were actively involved on ground, present physically in huge numbers, not in small numbers. So when you have 40,000 ships involved, docking and landing with all the trading posts, you can't say they were not involved and only some Africans. The Africans were fighting to survive and were not in any joy losing anybody whatsoever. But the stories, you hear all the stories, but you need to go back to the historical fact and show specific evidence. So the primary, and the word primary points to the Western European hegemony. Full stop.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ike. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Anwaze, you have the floor. You have 8 minutes, which you may or may not choose to use up.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I had a lot of historical inaccuracies in the last submission, and I'm going to give 3 examples with names to counter that. But before I start, I want to counter the last point that Dr. Eke made, where he said that in the 19th century there were a lot of Europeans on the ground. That is a fact, but that fact neglects the fact that for the previous 300 to 400 years, the Europeans could not come in, and the bulk of the slave trade, the vast majority of the slave trade, happened in that 300 to 400 year period. First, the British, by 1820, the British had already banned the slave trade, and by 1833, they had banned even slavery and were beginning to compensate slave owners. Quinine was first isolated in 1820, and that is the reason Europeans were able to come into Africa in large numbers after 1820. It's important to note that for context. In the previous 300 to 400 years, it was Africans who took the slaves to the coast and gave to the Europeans. That's very important. I'm going to use a modern day analogy. We tend to talk about corruption in our modern periods and talk about how Europeans aid Africans in taking our wealth and depositing it in European banks. That's very true. But saying that African trade, in the slave trade, will be akin to saying that the Africans who are taking our common patrimony now and taking it up to European banks did not have agency. Now, first person, King Alfonso of Congo. He traded slaves for himself and routinely blocked the sale of slaves in order to cause a scarcity in Brazil and drive up the price. That is very capitalist behavior, the kind of behavior that tells you that he made profit. The role of the Congo Kingdom is very, very understated in many of our discussions, not academically, but in many of our discussions about the transatlantic slave trade. The Congo Kingdom was the one that was responsible when the Portuguese first set up a plantation in what is now called Sao Tome. It was the Congo Kingdom that supplied the people. It was the Congo Kingdom that went on raids into the hinterland to bring people for the Portuguese. And they did it throughout the entirety of the slave trade with respect to Brazil. Secondly, Oba Ozolwa, Oba of Benin, actually put a ban on the export of women. On the export of men. It was only women that they were exporting. This was in the 16th century. He said that he needed the men to be warriors to go into places like Igala or the Western Igbo land in order to get, you heard it here, slaves. This was about 1758 or thereabouts. Again, one of the reasons that the Benin Empire became very powerful was the fact that it was supplied by the Portuguese. The Beninese were exchanging ambassadors with the Portuguese and were selling slaves to them in huge numbers. The third example I'll give, Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. He was captured in 1730. He was from what is now called Senegal. He was a titled man who was a slave trader and an Islamic scholar. During one of his trips to sell slaves, he himself was captured. His head was shaved to make him look like a war captive. That is the deceit that was routinely employed in capturing people. And I think it's important to insert a very interesting statistic. About 30% of all people who were traded and during this transatlantic slave trade were captured by people who were known to them. That is agency. So going back to the story of Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, he survived the Middle Passage after being sold and eventually ended up in Maryland, where they wanted him to farm tobacco, but finding him unsuitable for farming, he was made to rear cattle. Eventually, he managed to prove that he was an educated man, and he was sent to England after being freed. In 1734, he finally returned to the Gambia, and guess what? He resumed selling slaves, and pretty much sold slaves until he died in 1773, 30 years later. That is agency. Again, I want to build on what Tunde said. Europeans had their own parts in it, yes. But to deny that Africans were not a part of the slave trade is to deny history, and it's a fundamental thing that we miss in knowing where we went wrong. The critical statistic really is the statistic of the fact that, again, 30% of all those who were sold, 30% were captured and sold by people. Read Olaudah Equiano's book, chapter 2. He documented exactly how he was sold from hand to hand to hand. About 4 different sales before he ended up on the coast. Olaudah Equiano came from what is now called, from the area around the area that is now Ihiala in today's Anambra State. In those days, the journey would have taken weeks. And in those weeks, he was sold. So he was a slave pretty much from after the night he was captured. So we cannot and we should not deny that we had a part to play, and a significant part to play. Again, Bartholomew de Casas suggested coming to Africa to get slaves in about 1496. 1496 to 1820, that is 300 plus years in which the Europeans could not penetrate the. And that's very important. The Europeans finally got to isolate quinine in 1820, 300 years plus, almost 400 years. So what was happening in all that time? We need to understand and we need to accept the agency of our own ancestors in the trade. Once we accept that agency, again, going back to the point which Mr. Dele Ogun started with this, when he said that there could be no, the Europeans came via the oceans, and he referenced the fall of Constantinople. The fall of Constantinople was in 1453. It was a catalyst, yes. But the Europeans were not going to search for slaves. They were looking for gold. They were looking for a passage to the east. And it was somewhere along the line that the Kingdom of Congo supplied slaves for them to build their plantation in Sao Tome. We were a catalyst. Thank you very much.
But right now, I will return to the Dele Ogun team. So you've got 10 minutes to give your final remarks. Mr. Ogun, you have the floor.
I've understood our opponent's arguments. Let me debunk it immediately. Their argument is this. Europeans could not penetrate the hinterland in large numbers until quinine was invented in 1830s. But they contradict themselves in this respect. which is the in large numbers. It is an admission that the Europeans were going in, because there's actually evidence that they visited Benin City in the 1500s. So it's not that they weren't going in, they could not survive in the area. And that meant they had to recruit individuals, local individuals, as their agents for what was their principal enterprise. It's elementary. No one on our side is denying that there were no individual Africans that they used to conduct what was their enterprise. You only need to look at Kemi Badenoch. She was taken away from Nigeria. Did she not lead a trade mission back very recently on their side, wearing their colors, batting for Britain? Isn't that a simple illustration of the point? So if the other side seeking to argue, hide behind the fact that there were individuals here, individuals there, who they persuaded to engage in this trade, and that then means that those individuals are the we, then you can see the error or in their case. The British themselves were very clear. This was the British Prime Minister, Charles James Fox, during the abolition debate. He said, "We encouraged wars for the sake of taking not men's goods and possessions, but men themselves. And it was not the war which was the cause of the slave trade, but the slave trade which was the cause of the war. It was the practice of slave merchants to try to intoxicate the African kings in order to turn them to their purpose, to recruit them, to engage them." Yes, that is their own evidence. And Africans are saying, oh no, it was we Africans who were selling. That argument should be given a decent burial. Now, it is said that there was no side that was not aware of what the trade involved. Is there any evidence of any of these Africans visiting a slave plantation in the Caribbean? Is there any evidence? Their wars were being stimulated, instigating, as we're seeing. If anybody doesn't understand proxy war, look at Ukraine right now. The war is going on there. Weapons being supplied. That's what was going on in our territory. And it's suggested that Africans participate with full agency. What does that mean? Full agency. Meaning that they knew the conditions in which our people were chained on those ships because they were bringing them to the shore, because those individuals who were being supplied with the weapons and the rum and the chains were bringing them to the coast. The argument needs to be rethought and reconsidered. It was said that Kano's participation in the Saharan slave trade, you see, that was now mixed up with what we're discussing. They started from the Saharan slave trade. There's no dispute. There's clear evidence that the Fulani were active slave traders. They were supplying the Saharan routes. They had been supplied with the weapons. And they were capturing in great numbers. The last point that I want to make was this. I want to debunk this point about that I was playing semantics when I said that they were not slaves when they were taken from this shore. But the figure that Kunle gave us were tens of millions of our people were shipped across. Where were these people held in our space as slaves? Where were they held? They even had to build forts in order to hold them before they were shipping them off.
5 minutes, Dylan.
Let me hand over to Gabriel because I think I've made my points clearly. Gabriel, take over.
Thanks. Well, I think the first thing I need to debunk is the quinine business. Quinine did not actually stop malaria. It didn't stop malaria. And these people were in that place in huge numbers right from the 1600s. In fact, the Dutch warships were already there in numbers, and the British warships were there. So if you from 1620, 1630, they had huge numbers of warships from Guinea right all the way down at the moment. So they were there. They went into the coastal lands. They attacked and created all the proxy wars. This is not. That's the fact. The other thing is, when it comes to the, in fact, let me finish now. The issue of them, dying of malaria and all that, it was only about 25% death rate in total. But it didn't stop them. Okay, they took a risk in all these things they were doing. Now, when you come to 30% of our people being sold by people who know them, now that's actually there's no fact to that at all, not a single fact to that, because number one, it was abominable within the community, and it would be extremely rare case for somebody to even dare to do that. These were usually the cross-border, what you call attacks and raids during the proxy wars, that people were being carted away through those 4 channels on the Eastern Front. So, there's no such thing as people were selling their own people they knew and all that. That doesn't work at all. There's none of the communities will tolerate that or tolerated that at all. So let's just, finalize this thing with the factual common sense that this slave trade, transatlantic, will never have happened without the Western European hegemony. It's that simple and very straightforward. And if we try to blame our ancestors and blame, our forefathers and all that, well, let's just remember one thing: who had the control of the game. Even today, the name of our homelands is still within the Western European naming of our places and our countries. The official language in our little even villages is still the Western European languages. So the control has been there right from the start. And we need to change that narrative by being a bit more real. I can go into details, a little bit more details, because obviously on my mother's side, my great-great-grandfather was involved directly. So I can tell you, these Western Europeans were there in significant numbers. If you come to the Calabar areas and the Boni areas, and you will see where the names started from all those places, and some of their culture were brought in as well in the defeated and conquered areas across the coastal line. So, it's very straightforward. The primary people involved controlling the whole thing and profiting from the whole thing were the Western European hegemony, their official governments and monarchs. And our people have nothing to show for it.
Thank you, Dr. AK. Thank you very much. Tundele and Cheta, you have the floor.
So I'm just going to hit on a couple of things, and then I will read from direct quotes from Africans that were involved in slave trade, and then I'll give other examples. In terms of knowing, for example, Mr. Adelogun mentioned that Africans know the conditions of people on the plantations. Cheta gave one example of an African who was enslaved on a plantation and came back to trade slaves. I can give multiple other examples as well. For example, in the Calabar area, there's a guy called Coffee Duke, who was the nephew of the gentleman who I'm going to read from, Antara Duke, who was sold into slavery because him and his fellow slave traders were quarreling, and they tricked him onto a ship, and they took him to a plantation to work. Coffee Duke was brought back eventually by his when his own brother became his cousin, Antara Duke, became the leader. and he continued trading slaves straight away. This was somebody who was sold to a plantation. I'll give the example of King Gezo of Dahomey. King Gezo of Dahomey, when he overthrew his brother Adandozan of Dahomey, and he took on the throne, the first thing he did was to send to Brazil, Bahia in Brazil, to fetch his mother, who had been sold into slavery when his brother became king earlier. Do we say Gezo didn't know? In Lagos, Dada Antonio Oshoditakpa were sent to Brazil to go and study how to trade slaves. And they went to Bahia, they went to the plantations before they came back to Lagos to work for the Lagos Kings as slave traders. So let's not take away the fact that our people actually travel to those places to go and see things. There were African kings that owned ships, trading ships, in partnership with Liverpool merchants. So they were not people that did not understand what they were doing. They knew exactly what they were doing. I'm going to read from Antera Duke here. This is Antera Duke from Calabar. Another point I wanted to make, Dr. Eke mentioned that in the eastern axis, there were only 4 embarkment points. This is incorrect. This is historical. In Calabar alone, there were 4. Duketown, there was Duketown, there was Creektown, there was Newtown, and there was one more, just in the Calabar area alone. Before we go further and we see Bonny, we see all those other places where they were embarking slaves. If we go further, we'll see Ugotan, which was called Guato by the Portuguese, which was the Benin Oba's official embarkment point. If we go further to the west, we'll get to Lagos. If we go further to the west, we'll get to Badagry, Epe, Ibeshe. If we go further to the west, we get to Porto Novo, we get to Ouida, we get to Alada, we get to Little Popo, Grand Popo. These were multiple cities along the coast where the only thing that they did, the primary trade from those cities, participated in by virtually everybody in those cities, from the elite to the least, was slave trade. It talked about the Aro, and being criminal elements in the Aro were the people that participated in the slave trade. This is patently historical. The Aro organized their society around slave trade. They were well known. Every Igbo person that is on this call who is aware of the history will know the history of the Aro within Igbo land. So we can't this is what I usually react to when we're trying to paint these historical facts as ahistorical. How can we say it was criminal elements in the Aro culture, where the whole oracle that the culture was centered around was built around tricking people into slavery? We can't do that. We had dynasties, we had kings. This is Antara Duke, who was the ruler of Duketown. He was talking June 14, 1785. This is his diary. About 6 a.m. at Aqua Landing, a fine morning, Duke Ephraim sent to call us to get to Essien's house to see what he paid to come round Backsider Bass's headman for slaves. He paid somebody who brought slaves from Interland 560 coppers for all. So they chopped a doctor, which means they took an oath to agree to obtain slaves for Duke. We made one canoe. They built a canoe themselves to carry them home. All the Obong men all the Obong's men went to Willie Honesty's hometown. I'll go to another page in this man's diary, page 157, and I can share this book. It's out of copyright, so I can freely share it with the group if Connie permits. Further down, July 21.
Yes, you are permitted. Please kindly share when you are done.
At 6 a.m. at Aqua Landing, a fine morning, I went on board Cooper's ship. He went on the ship himself, and Essien went on board Cumberbatch's ship. We came ashore at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I sent a pawn with Essien to give Cumberbatch to get 8 slaves to pay Captain Tatum. So I have paid Tatum for all I owed, and at 7 o'clock, I sent my brother Egboyong and Terra to Bootsam. The Egboyong is the one that was continue selling to Bootsam to trade for slaves. He sent his brother to trade for slaves. It wasn't that it was a hidden thing. These were people that knew what they were doing. This guy was writing in 1785. And I can go further back to people in this same area that were writing in the early 1700s. In the history of the empire that I specialize in, there were kings who, if you listen to their praise names, the panegyrics, you will hear their participation. The driving force for Oyo conquering to the coast was to control the slave trade through the Egbado corridor, controlled Dahomey, controlled Wida, controlled Badagry. That was the driving force of the Oyo conquest towards the coast. Before then, the Oyo were not interested in going to the coast. So let's not take away agency. I think it irks me when we say our kings were just giving rum and then they were hoodwinked into selling people. That diminishes our people a lot more than admitting that they were very, very clear economic actors who knew what they were doing and participated. We cannot say our people were, it's the writing of a racist to justify what they were doing at the time, and we're taking it as the gospel. I'll yield the floor to Cheta to continue.
Okay, so one of the things about us as a people is we tend to be very emotional about so many things in our history and pretend as if our forefathers were all holding hands and singing Kumbaya. You see that it's one of the reasons why we tend to, even in our modern history, pretend that certain things that happened. So, for example, if I say that Murtala Muhammad was a very bad man and a war criminal, people will attack me like he was. He was a bad man and he was a war criminal. It's a historical fact. It is not individual Africans, or it is not just individual Africans that were involved in the slave trade. It was institutional in many parts. There were several African empires that were engaged in the trade. Benin, Aro, Dahomey, Songhai, Ashanti, Oyo. I could mention more if I had the time. As a matter of fact, when the British banned the slave trade, the Ashanti king wrote to protest that why are you banning this trade that has made all of us so much money? This letter is on record. As Tunde pointed out in his initial argument, Africans were selling themselves as well. Again, I referred you to chapter 2 of Olaudah Equiano's book. That book was written in the 18th century. It's out of copyright. I have a copy. I could share it. He described his journey from his village to the coast. He was sold multiple times. I gave the biography of an African, Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, who was sold, who was tricked, kidnapped, sold, eventually freed, and then came back and resumed participating in the trade. You can't say that such a person did not know what was happening. He survived the Middle Passage. Same thing as Tunde elaborated with Tantara Duke's nephew. He survived the Middle Passage. With respect to the queening thing, it is a historical fact again. I think we're playing semantics when we say, oh, huge numbers or significant numbers. Colonialism was not viable until the Europeans were able to fight off malaria. It was a problem. Of course, some Europeans made it through, but there was a very high mortality rate. That's the reason why our part of the world was called the white man's grave. They didn't come in in viable enough numbers for them to do the dirty work themselves, but they had very willing participants. And these willing participants had a 1,000-year history of collaborating with the trans-Saharan slave trade. So when you try to say that we did not have agency in this, that is untrue. We had agency. So again, please, it's very important for us if we want to move away from where we are, ergo a low trust society, which is what we are. We should be able to remove the rose-tinted spectacles, look to our past, look to the fact that our ancestors were not perfect people. They were human beings with all the flaws of being human. Some of my ancestors were involved in the kidnap of the Landa brothers in 1823, and they were in the process of negotiating to sell them to the king of Abo down the river. So this trade existed among our people. We used to buy people and we used to sell people. And slavery continued in our own region even after the British banned it. One of the pretexts that the British used to destroy Asaba in 1888 was the large slave market in Asaba. So again, it is ahistorical for us to sit and claim that, oh, the form of slavery we had was nice and benign and all of that. It was brutal. Many of the people that we used to buy and sell as slaves then were bought and sold to be buried with chiefs. This was our history. On a personal note, one of the reasons why I, an Igbo man, tend to look at our history more critically is that I am a twin. I'm fully aware of the fact that if I was born 100 years earlier than when I was born, I would have been taken to Ajoafia and left to die. So that knowledge has made me more critical to be able to look at our ancestry, our culture, our traditions in a more critical manner. It's something that I expect everyone who is a history, who studies history to do. Look at our history more critically. We had good portions like every group, but like every group, we also had bad portions. And our people actively participated in the slave trade, period. Thank you very much.
We're going to open the floor for questions before we eventually round up. We've got about 10 minutes to do that. We'll take questions from the audience or comments. Please keep them very brief. But I'm going to start. I'm going to kick off with a question. My first question is to the Tunde team. The debate topic emphasizes the word primary. Could you clarify, is your position that the Africans were the primary agents, or were you arguing that both were primary agents? That's my question to your team. And then to the Dele Ogun team, my question is, are you in any way arguing that, well, I listened to what you said, so permit me if, I mean, your answers were obvious while you spoke, but maybe I'm just trying to get you to emphasize. Are you in any way arguing that the Africans were not majorly involved in this transatlantic slave trade? So let me yield the floor to the Tunde team first, and then we'll come to the Dele Ogun team next, and then the floor will be opened. All right, so Tunde, please make it very brief. We've got a few minutes.
Okay, thank you. So I think maybe to answer the question, I think permit me to rig my rule a little. Let me turn on my camera. Permit me to rig my rule a little. When Tunde signed me up for this, let me throw my guy under the bus a little. He signed me up without telling me. It's something that we've been discussing for quite a while. So he signed me up without telling me. And the first thing I told him was that I think that a better framing of the question would have been something along the lines of whether we were just agents or whether we had agency, or whether we were just observers or whether we were participants, because we were very willing participants. Having said that, I would concede to Mr. Ogun his initial arguments when he started, during his first point, that at the start, the Europeans were the primary drivers. But over the course of 4 centuries, just like if you have an insurance, your car insurance, let's say me, my wife are on a car insurance plan, and I'm the primary driver. At some point, I could shift her to being the primary driver. So at some point, we became primary agents. And I think that is proved by the fact that the age of the enlightenment happened in Europe. You had William Wilberforce and his menagerie, and they managed to get finally through parliament in the UK a ban on the slave trade. And the people who kicked against it primarily were our people. The people who kicked against it primarily were our people. Again, like I said, the king of Ashanti wrote to the British. Tunde gave the very, very good example of King Gezo of Dahomey, who, knowing fully well his mother had been kidnapped before he seized the throne, knowing fully well he sent people to go and extract his mother, but he continued selling slaves. He continued making war on surrounding kingdoms and selling slaves. That's a primary agent. That person was a primary agent.
So you
Oh,
argue that over the course of 400 years, as time went by, Africans became the primary agents.
yes. So I would argue that. And now we yield to Tunde so that he can make a point as well.
Right, thank you very much. So the quick point is this, that one, for the trade, and the keyword operative word is trade, there are two sides to the trade. There is the supply side and there is the demand side. The primary agents on the demand side were the Europeans. But the primary agents on the supply side of that trade were African traders. And that is the historical facts. That's our position.
All right, I've been unmuted now. Let me deal very quickly with, it doesn't matter how the other side tries to frame the question. Even if they reframe it as whether we were just observers or participants, the evidence is against them, because the key is the we. We were selling our own people. We were the primary agents on the supply side. Is English language we're using. Who are the we? You're talking about individuals, even if they're monarchs, even if they're obas or chiefs. Are they representative? These were not even now we talk about our government. Are they representative? In a representative system, you can say we, whatever your leader does, taints the rest of you. But when, as the evidence showed very clearly from the British Prime Minister himself, that we instigated these wars, supplied them the weapons, when the other side tried to argue that they're now saying on the supply side, on the demand side, even on the supply side, the weapons, the guns, the chains, they were critical instruments in the supply side. And then they target the characters. I mean, on the platform, I noticed that there were some disputes about language. Austin Otto used the word quislings, sellouts. I have no doubts that there were some who were enslaved, who became good slaves, the house niggers, who now were taken on board by their former enslavers, overseeing the plantations, whipping their brothers and sisters even more severely than perhaps the whites will have done. And then those ones going back and become entrepreneurs in their own right, enslaving people or capturing people from other communities and other societies. But the suggestion that we had European type slavery in West Africa before the Europeans came, that needs to be dismissed. Now, coming to the question that you put to our side, whether we're arguing that Africans were not majorly involved. As I said, it's a question of what do you mean by we? When you blame our ancestors, are they representative? If the Europeans come in, targeted a chief, supplied them with rum on their own evidence, supplied them with weapons, let's even give it a modern context. How representative is Zelensky, who's been supplied with weapons to perpetuate this war? He couldn't even have an election recently. I just want to give it context when we're talking about we have agency. Yes, there were individuals, they themselves said it, So we're not arguing that. They themselves said it, that we encourage wars for the sake of taking goods, not goods and possessions, but men themselves. It was the practice of slave merchants to try to intoxicate the African kings, those individuals, but please do not stretch the conduct of those compromised individuals, just like our compromised political leaders now, to say that is the we. That is our case.
All I just want to say is we need to be very mindful of that impression that our people were just sitting there doing nothing, waiting for the slave trade to start, and they were all eager. They had nothing else to do. All they did was just sell anybody they see, catch somebody, sell. I think, if you go back to the culture of that time and what the people, if you take their daily lives, you realize that none of this narrative is true. They had more important things to do.
Okay. It's interesting the way you put it. They were busy.
Yeah, because I lived there, and I lived there in 1980. I remember going there, and there was not even a single theft in that kingdom. So so I know their mentality. So let's not use narratives to smear everybody. Our people were vastly civilized at the time, and we're not interested in that sort of trade.
So, okay, we're going to do quickly the floor. We're going to open the floor for 10 minutes. We have to finish before it is 8 p.m. Absolutely. So that when we invite you to come for the next one, you won't go all scared about those people who waste a lot of time.
Thank you so much for a great time here and the presentation. My question is primarily for Dele Ogun's team. So I think I understand that the we wasn't representative of the populace. So my question is, does that same apply? I mean, can that same argument be made for the European protagonists of the slave trade, the leaders, the business people, the Liverpool merchants? Can we say they also were not representative of the European populace, in prosecuting the transatlantic slave trade? Thank you.
Very short answer is that yes, absolutely. The people of Britain did not know, the ordinary people of Britain did not know what was going on in those slave plantations, in the Jamaicas, in the Barbados, the cruelty, the evil, the wickedness. So yes. And so if we can't blame the ordinary British people, why should Africans been saying we did it? There were actors on both sides. The principals were those European traders in human suffering. They had local agents, the Quislings, to use the language of Mr. Ostinotter. We were not selling our people. The ordinary British people were not the ones trading. They benefited. That is the difference. They were beneficiaries of the enterprise, but we were not beneficiaries on our side. I hope that answers your point.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, debaters. I want to thank the debaters for coming here today. I've followed Tunde Yellow on YouTube. I've watched his documentaries. I also recently found out about Dele Ogun, and I've read all his books. And so I really appreciate this debate and this conversation. My question is to both debaters on both sides as to what justifies colonization in Africa. If, though we know Europeans benefited from colonization, so what then justifies colonization if one group is actually saying we Africans were the primary actors in slavery as opposed to the Europeans doing that? And the other question I also have is the fact that why did slavery take so long in Brazil and Cuba before it was actually abolished in both countries? That's my question.
Okay, he asked, thanks for the question. He asked what justifies colonialism in Africa. Nothing justifies it. I think we should get that out of the way. it's important to note that throughout history, people have gone out of their comfort zones in order to build wealth, in order to become rich. So if you look at it in absolute terms, going all the way back to the Battle of Kush, and then to ancient Egypt, and then to the Greeks, to the Romans, when you hear the word empire, you have an empire. What that means is that by definition, somewhere is the colony of that empire. So how do you prevent yourself from becoming the colony of someone else? You build yourself. You make yourself impossible or very difficult to defeat. It's something that we had not done, or even till now, we have not done. In many respects, we are colonies, even till this day. Right now, we are more in, it's a more benign economic colonialism, benign in quotes. But if you strip away all the finery of it, we are colonies of, in some cases, Western countries, in some cases, the Chinese, in some cases, the Russians. There's a reason why, for example, between the two of them, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire produce 60% of the world's cocoa, but almost all the chocolate is produced in either Belgium or the Netherlands or Switzerland, and then sold back to the Ghanaians and the Ivorians. Nigeria is not even in that discussion anymore. We're falling off in terms of cocoa production. So colonialism doesn't need a justification. It's just simple. Some people want to get rich. They are able to marshal their whatever little resources they have and extract resources from other people to make themselves rich. Why did slavery last so long in Brazil and Cuba? I mean, it's important to point out that it was the British who banned slavery when, at a point in time when they had the most powerful navy. But the Americans didn't ban slavery or did not stop slavery until about 50 years after the British, and the Americans had to fight a war to stop slavery. So slavery continued in Brazil for another 20 years or thereabouts, and it continued in Cuba for about the same time period. Different people come to enlightenment at different points in their history, different points in time. To use the example that I gave earlier, the killing of twins in our part of the world stopped at different points in time in different parts. When people say Mary Slessor was the one who stopped the killing of twins, that's not entirely accurate. The Obong of Calabar of 1850 outlawed the killing of twins, but it took another 50 years or so, including work by Mary Slessor, about give or take 30, 40 years after the Obong of Calabar's initial ban, before the killing of twins began to gain more, before stopping the killing of twins began to gain more wider acceptance. So these kind of things are basically about timing. An idea, no matter how good it is, does not immediately gain wide acceptance. You need people who will campaign, and in some cases, you need the power of the force of arms of a state. So going back to that killing of twins example, or even slavery. For slavery, the Royal Navy had to go out into the ocean to stop the transatlantic slave, and they were not entirely successful. The slave trade still went on in various forms, but at a diminished level for another 30, 40 years. Killing of twins did not fully stop in what is now southeast and south Nigeria until about the end of the British punitive expeditions in 1914. So I hope I've answered the question.
Thank you very much. I just want to make comments. I'm not asking a question. I think for me, the issue here is the operative word is primary. It is the Europeans who brought the trade. Whether Africans participated or not, it's the Europeans who started it, who provided all the equipment and everything, and the know-how of how to do it. And I think we need to remember that in the same way that we, Black people, we are given, we tend to claim all the ills of the things that happen to us as if we perpetrated it on each other. If you look at what is going on now, just because people are now asking for reparations, then the blame is being shifted to make it like, oh, well, you did it to yourselves. If you look at the situation of knife crime, people will lead you to believe that it's black on black when the black boy stabs another one. Nobody talks about the whites stabbing each other in Glasgow as white on white. So we need to be very, very careful about the things that we accept as our fault. Thank you.
Interesting. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as much as I can still see hands flying up, but we will have to stop here. We'll stir up our interest on subjects, and we'll get us researching and studying and finding answers of our own. I know some of us have very strong views about this debate, strong positions, but it is what it is. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for coming. This is the Nigeria History Group. Before we go, please, let's do that poll again. Is the poll up? And see you next time. Thank you to the debaters, Tundeleye, Cheta, Dele Ogun, and Dr. AK. Thank you. You did great.
Thank you.